In 1585, Queen Elizabeth I of England granted an area of land on Roanoke Island to Sir Walter Raleigh, giving him the title of Lord Proprietor. However, 2 years later, when it was realized that the colony wasn't working out, Raleigh left and completely forgot about the island until 16 degrees later. When he returned to check up on his colony, it had vanished. The entire settlement was literally wiped off the face of the earth with no trace of what had happened. It would become known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and even to this day we don't know exactly what happened here. But these are the most likely reasons why the colony was abandoned. So first of all, let's talk about where exactly Roanoke is, because if you're not familiar with the geography of North Carolina, then the name might not ring any bells. Roanoke is actually quite a significant island. It's the largest of a group of barrier islands which sit just off the coast of the Outer Banks. These islands act as a protective barrier between the mainland and the Atlantic Ocean, forming a large shallow sound in between them. This is what we call the Albemarle Sound. But back in the late 16th century, Europeans didn't really know too much about the rest of the world, so they had no idea that this wasn't actually an island at all. They thought it was simply a large peninsula, and because the area was so heavily forested, they couldn't really see across the sound either. So again, they believed it to be an island. This lack of geographical knowledge would prove to be pretty problematic for the English settlers who would arrive here soon after. But before we get into that, now you need to understand that when Raleigh was given Roanoke, it was under the condition that he had to establish a settlement there. See, the English were well aware that Spain had established settlements in Florida, and they were worried that if they didn't start establishing settlements in the New World, then other countries such as France or the Netherlands might beat them to valuable lands further north. So they began to hand out charters to various nobles, granting them rights to establish colonies in these areas. Raleigh, for example, was given rights to establish a colony anywhere between the 36th and 40th parallels north. But this didn't mean that he had free rein over the area. He had to actually establish a settlement there, or else he would lose the rights to the land. Now, by 1585, when Raleigh received his charter for Roanoke, he knew full well that he didn't want to establish a settlement all the way up north. There were already plenty of French settlements in Canada, and he didn't want to compete with them there. Instead, he wanted something much more valuable: gold. The further south he went, the more likely he would be able to find gold. But unfortunately, while exploring the area, he found very little of it. And so he decided to settle on Roanoke Island instead. He figured that if he couldn't find gold, then at least he would be close enough to the Spanish settlements that he could trade with them. But things didn't quite go according to plan. You see, by the time the English settlers arrived on Roanoke in 1587, the Spanish had pushed much further north than anyone expected, and so Roanoke was now well out of trading range. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because it meant that the settlers weren't harassed by the Spanish, but it did mean that they were completely on their own. They were now hundreds of miles away from any other European settlements. The English colony was built around a small inlet on the west side of the island called CROATOAN Sound. This location was chosen specifically because it was one of the few natural harbors on the island. But this harbor was a bit of a misnomer because it wasn't really a harbor at all. There were sandbars just offshore which made it impossible for large ships to dock here. What the settlers really had was a small inlet with a beach. This turned out to be a terrible location to build a settlement. You see, the reality of living on a barrier island soon smacked them in the face. Just a few weeks after they arrived, a violent storm came through and completely destroyed the harbor, making it even more difficult for ships to reach the settlement. Then, right after that, another storm came through and washed away the entire beach, leaving the colony only a few feet away from the rising sea. Not only that, but since the colony was built within the protective barrier of the island, they didn't realize how destructive hurricanes can be. They had no idea that every year a hurricane would come through and cause massive destruction, on the island. And finally, life on the island was really hard because they had no idea what type of environment they were actually in. Again, they thought they were on a peninsula, not a barrier island, and so they had no idea that there was water on 3 sides of them. They had no idea that there were giant storms brewing in the ocean around them, and they certainly had no idea how to survive on a barrier island. This led to the rapid decline of the colony. Within 2 years of arriving, they sent multiple pleas back to England, asking to be relieved of duty. They wrote letters explaining that they had no hope of surviving another winter on the island. By 1587, the colony was completely out of food and supplies. They had been subsisting on nothing but fish and corn. Even worse, the local Native Americans had grown tired of the English encroaching on their territory. They attacked the settlement several times and stole their food. At this point, the colony had 2 options. They could either stay on Roanoke and slowly starve to death, or they could abandon the colony and try to make it to one of the Spanish settlements in Florida. Unfortunately, most of the colonists chose the former option. They refused to leave. But why? Well, you see, during the first 2 years of the colony, 28 men had been killed in battles with the Native Americans, leaving only 90 colonists alive. Of those 90, half were women and children. So really, the only ones capable of making the journey to the Spanish settlements were the 45 male colonists. But they refused to leave. They wouldn't abandon the settlement, not to mention the fact that the person in charge, John White, was awaiting supplies from England. He didn't want to leave without him, but eventually they ran out of food and were forced to abandon the settlement. Most of the colonists chose to head south to the nearest Spanish settlement, which was in present-day South Carolina. They were hoping to barter with the Spanish for food and supplies. And then once White arrived, they could head back up north and re-establish the colony. When John White arrived to Roanoke in 1590, he found the settlement completely abandoned. All of the buildings were destroyed, most of the crops were trampled, and everything was in ruins. He searched the entire settlement for some sort of explanation as to what happened, but he found none. He did find the name CROATOAN carved into a post. This was the name of the local Native American tribe. But whether this meant that they had taken the settlers or that the settlers had gone there willingly was unknown. White would sail back to England and alert the officials there, but no one would take him seriously. The colony had been gone for 3 years at this point, and everyone assumed that they had just integrated into one of the nearby settlements. Eventually, after many attempts, White would finally get permission to go back to the New World and search for his friends. He explored the area and eventually landed on the mainland near present-day Wilmington. There he found the skeleton of one of the colonists and a few pieces of pottery. This was all the evidence he would ever find. It's believed that the remaining colonists probably headed to CROATOAN Island, where they lived with the Native Americans. But there is also a good chance that they were killed by the Spanish, and their skeletons now lay somewhere in the deserts of South Carolina. Regardless, we may never know exactly what happened to them. Thanks for watching.